Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back, everyone. I am thrilled with having one of my favorite guests return. Welcome back, Jen Reisinger, LMHC. Hey, Jen.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here.
Thanks for popping on. I know you're busy juggling a lot of different roles today, so I appreciate you taking the time.
Of course, but that's like the reality. I was thinking about this before I came on today, just thinking like, this is the reality of grief, right? It doesn't just occur when everything is tidy and like we have all of the time and that we can just set things aside. Like the reality is it just comes crashing in at unpredictable times and you are at different bandwidths at different times. So it actually makes a ton of sense, I think, that we're here together today to talk about this because this is the actual reality.
Absolutely. And we both have sick households. Both of our little ladies are ill and I'm still struggling with my own health stuff. And yeah, it's a lot right now, but grief still shows up regardless of how many spoons we have, where we're at with our capacity.
Yeah. And that there are things that we're still needing to attend to and some things that we're needing to let go of a little bit in order to make space for our grief. And that can feel really hard too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it continues to show up over time. That was what we talked about as our kind of theme or focus for today is, yes, grief can feel really tough in those early days and seasons. And it also continues to show up over time and can become even more unpredictable because you just really don't know when a wave's going to sneak attack you.
Yeah. I lost my mom. It's been about 11 years. So there's been some time that has gone on and I can typically predict like some of the seasons that are going to maybe feel a little bit more tender, a little more difficult, but the ones where it still takes me by surprise, those always feel hard, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is important to recognize that it never just okay. Like sometimes we have a like warm memory and that feels good. I remember doing this with my mom and it feels really good to remember it. But sometimes it just sweeps you off your feet and that is okay. Right?
Yeah.
I think that in a lot of the experience that I have working with the clients that I work with is being able to normalize that is okay, that's so human. It makes so much sense that it could take us right off of our feet.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the metaphors we use often are like waves of grief.
Yeah.
And we both know that grief doesn't just fade away. It shows up in waves, sometimes when we're least expecting it. So how do you describe those waves to clients, especially when it hits maybe years later?
Yeah, I often talk about it, what I learned from a little boy that I worked with early on in my career, where he talked about the waves that we can predict in the ocean that are like, there's some that are small or big, but we predict it, they make sense. But then there's like a tsunami event, right? And that is actually really devastating.
Yeah.
And I just recently was talking with a client about the tsunami. And as we were talking more about it, she's like, I don't understand why I'm not feeling better. Like, it's been a couple days. Like, I should be like back up and running. Like, I don't understand why I'm still feeling this. And so then we talked about what is the reality actually of a tsunami? That is a major natural disaster, right?
Yeah.
That causes immense destruction. It's not just a big wave, right? It didn't just maybe pull out some logs out to the ocean. Like, it can cause major damage. And so the recovery from a tsunami event will require care also for our grief. It's going to require care and time. And so it does make sense when it's a few days, it's longer than that, that you are piecing things back together and trying to make sense of it. We can think about the landscape after a tsunami, like a true tsunami, and not being able to understand like where were the houses or what was here or what is all of this debris? What was that attached to? It makes so much sense in our grief too, to be like, wow, I feel really destroyed right now. And I'm trying to piece it together and make sense of it. Why did it show up this way? What memories are coming up? What am I remembering? What am I missing? What am I longing for? And it touches all these areas of our lives. And so to be able to make space for it and to care for ourselves as we're recovering from it, is so important.
I think that's such an important reminder. Wow, I'm still just floored by that's such a great metaphor because I talk about waves with my clients too. And I haven't thought of putting it in that practical. Okay, when we think about a tsunami, that neighborhood area is devastated for a while. Like it takes time to rebuild and figure out where things went. And even just getting electricity back or plumbing, like that can take days. And so when you think about the emotional impact of a grief tsunami, yeah, that might knock you out for a week or two.
Yeah.
And that's normal
And
and
going back to your
expected.
point about like it takes a little while to get electricity or plumbing, let's think about your early grief reactions. How did it impact your body?
Yeah.
Were you exhausted? Did
Yeah.
you have stomach issues? Like all
Yeah.
of these things that you may have experienced early in grief, you might be experiencing again. It doesn't mean that you've gone backwards. It means that this is just part of your grief.
Totally. Oh, that's brilliant. I love it. I love it so much. That's so relatable.
But nature teaches us so much about grief. We
Yeah.
talk about nature all the time in our grief practices, like thinking about seasons of grief and how the seasons outside in nature and what that can that teach us. And the ocean makes a ton of sense too as we're thinking
Yeah.
about our grief experiences and what healing looks like over time and how our grief changes over time.
Yeah. That's making me even think about so Jen and I were in the Pacific Northwest and last week and this week a little bit too, we've had a lot of snow. And so in thinking about like those winter phases of grief and everything is covered in that cold, frozen, still stuck. There's not growth happening. So yeah, just to go on with your point, yeah, nature does teach us a lot about grief and we can find different ways for representation within that natural landscape that reflects where we're at in our grief. And I think that's I love a good metaphor. I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
reminder.
Winter is really one of my favorites too. I think,
Yeah.
especially thinking with grief, because we're coming from holidays and then heading into New Year, which is supposed to be fresh and like all of this growth and like new year, new me. And it just feels like you're so out of sync when you're grieving. But the reality of winter is that maybe there really is growth happening, but it is very small, right? Or it's
Yeah.
not the kind of grief that we're seeing yet that we
Yeah.
do in spring, right? All of that work is happening in the ground, right? But we're not outside yelling at the plants to grow. Oh, you should be growing by now. That's not what we're doing because we know that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But we, especially the clients that I work with, I often work with like really high achieving women who they have a strong personality. They love a checklist. They're going to push through all of the hard things, get it done, and then they're going to be on the other side. But grief is so different.
Yeah.
And so they can be so hard on themselves.
Oh my gosh,
Like,
absolutely.
why am I not better? I
Well,
must not be trying hard enough. Oh, why am I feeling like this again? I'm back to square one. What is wrong with me? Those are the kinds of things I hear from the clients I'm working with. And it's, oh, let's think about that, those plants outside in winter, right? It makes sense that they're
totally.
hibernating, that their growth looks different right now.
And I think that leads into that lingering myth that grief has an expiration date. And I mean, you and I obviously know, like, it's more learning to live with those new rhythms of grief and
Yeah.
following it through the different seasons and that it doesn't really go away. It just gets different.
Mhm.
So I guess, what do you wish people understood about how grief actually sticks with us?
Yeah, I think about it as being woven into who you are. And
Mm.
like at different times, like with fabric, right? There's different like threads that get caught. And it makes sense and to be really gentle. I had an experience actually I had a party for my 40th birthday and my dad came and he brought with this plate with
Oh,
my handprint and my mom's. And this is from when I was 3. And I didn't expect I did not expect it. My dad has been and he's later in like his life season, and so he's doing a lot of like giving away of some things, but I wasn't expecting something sentimental.
mm,
And it was one of those, probably not a tsunami moment, but it was unexpected. And then I'm trying to like host a party. And so that's also the reality of the messiness of grief, right? Is that it
right.
can show up in all of these different spaces. And and I could have maybe tried to like shove that down, that feeling down, like, oh, thanks, dad, and put that away. But instead, I like let myself have the tears and the hug with my dad. And he's not like an emotionally sensitive kind of guy. Typically, he really means well, but that's just not his forte. But obviously, he knew my mom. And it was important for me to be able to make space for that
Mm.
grief experience. And then even from that, like there's still ripples. Like I look at this sitting now on my desk and like thinking about what do I do with this? And I don't know. I think with grief over time, when that thread gets pulled, no, it's just so important to give it some room
Yeah.
and to not rush it. And that is also a reflection of our love, is that it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be rushed and that we can create the space for it, to care for it, that it makes sense that it's there, and that it's a way of being close to the person that we've lost.
Yeah. Oh, first, thank you for sharing that plate moment. That's so special. And yeah, and as someone who was at that party, I would imagine that would have been very surprising and unexpected. And I love your dad, and he is the king of cheesy jokes. And so to have a sentimental, thoughtful gift, like, yeah, that lands different in an
Yeah.
unexpected way. And
Well,
how
and
do
I
I
think,
take care of myself while
yeah.
hosting? And yet you still were able to make space for yourself to feel. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And even I got teary in that moment, right? And just like it would be something that maybe my dad normally would just move on from, but I spoke. And like when I speak, when I'm crying, like I just sound like a mess. It's really hard for me to communicate when I'm crying. And so then he got choked up, and he had been married to my mom for a very long time, and his life has continued to move forward since her death. And we don't sometimes talk about her. And I think about her all the time, and I'm sure he does too. And so finding those moments in shared grief where you're
Yeah.
able to connect over that loss is really important. I'm really glad we had that experience, even if it's in the middle of this party, just to be able to know like we are in connection. I'm not alone in this grief, because grief is also relational and it impacts my family. And that my mom is not forgotten, and she's always there. It was good and hard in so many different ways.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great reminder that, again, you said it's been, what, around 11
11
years,
years, yeah.
and it can surprise us, and we can learn how to make space for it in a way that's meaningful us, even in the midst of chaos and the busyness of life and the messiness of life, is you let that grief show up how it needed to, and you honored it, and by doing so, it's honoring that love for your mom and that she is still an active part of your guys' lives.
Yeah. And I think too, with grief over time, it's helpful to know how grief shows up for you, because your grief changes over time, but to really understand what your grief is like and how you typically experience it is also helpful. For me, I know when I'm going through hard seasons, I long for my mom. Like
Mm,
I would do anything to pick up the phone, to call her, to be able to just have someone that is always in my corner. And so I know when I'm entering hard seasons, I need to build my community. And like, it's really important for me to have that and to care for myself and having community. And so that's one way, like, I proactively help support myself with grief. And so I think with my clients too about, okay, how does your grief show up? Are you noticing it really shows up in physical ways? And so maybe you're needing to make sure you're buffering more rest time. We often talk about coping ahead or an aftercare plan, but maybe we need to have it be more stretched out throughout a season that you know is going to be more difficult, where your grief is going to be more triggered.
mm,
Or if you're knowing like it's going to really, my grief typically shows up, I don't know, as just like being stuck in my head and looping around thoughts, like maybe that's a great time to have a little bit extra therapy support, or that you restart that journaling practice that you set down for a while so that you're able to move things from your head.
yeah,
So thinking about that too, what does your grief look like? And then how can you support yourself when you're having those moments that are re-triggered grief?
yeah. I think that's so smart, that reminding ourselves of those, like the coping ahead plans, the aftercare plans. I was talking with a client earlier this week about March is a rough month for them, and the anniversary date is later in the month, but it's almost like the 1st of March hits, and it's like their whole body just has a reaction.
Yeah.
And that happens 2 different months of the year. It's like the anniversary of their passing and then that person's birthday month. Like those are their 2 tough months. And we were talking about, whether that's doing some different, like, additional therapy sessions. This person really enjoys being outdoors, and, how to plan some more hikes during the week, or even with the semi-gross weather, do we get a different raincoat or different shoes so that we can feel more comfortable in the PNW doing these kinds of outdoor walks? But just being intentional with, okay, I know this is a tougher month. What are ways to set myself up to be successful in honoring my grief and what my body needs, what my brain space needs, what my emotional connectivity to other needs? Yeah.
And I think we often talk about specific events, right? We talk about that anniversary of the death date or a specific holiday, right? But sometimes it's broader than that. It's the entire month, right? It's an entire season. Maybe as somebody, especially someone who maybe had a prolonged illness, like a diagnosis date, and then, okay, now I can remember they went to the hospital on this day, or they went home on hospice, or whatever the sequence of events
Yeah.
was, it can be prolonged. And so knowing if that is the time that you're feeling your grief more acutely, even years down the road, first of all, that makes sense. And second of all, then what can you do to support yourself based on what you know about your grief today? And
Yeah.
that might be different than what it was a few years ago. I know for me, my grief looks different than it did a few years ago, and I need different things. And that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then in talking about carrying our grief forward instead of quote unquote letting it go, what do you think carrying grief in a sustainable way looks like for the people that you work with?
Yeah. And it looks so different, right? So that is figuring out, like, what is my grief and what does that look like? What feels meaningful? How do I find those moments of connection with my loved one? I frequently am working with women who have experienced a pregnancy, loss of an infant or child. And so figuring out, what does this look like for me? I have a lot of clients that do some really special things, right?
Yeah.
That then are integrating their child's memory into their everyday life, or maybe they're doing things like scholarships or memorial tattoos. There's so many different ways that we can create meaningful ritual that helps us feel connected and that we can even replicate over time. Right? Like
Yeah.
different things we do seasonally. Planting is often, like gardens and things like that, can be really meaningful because just like we were talking about at the beginning, right? The nature cycles and watching something grow and tending to it can feel really meaningful. And so
Yeah.
finding what feels meaningful to you, because you can find a list of different meaningful activities that you can do that maybe memorialize your person. But if it doesn't connect with you, it's not yours.
Absolutely.
And that is okay. There is not a right way. And so sometimes it is like maybe trying something to be like, that's not for me. Okay. Okay. You just learned something really important. I'm so glad
Mm.
we learned that, because now we're closer to figuring out what feels supportive for you.
And it goes back to that grief isn't one size fits all. And I remember working with a client, and their parent would come visit in all the new places they would live, and they'd go find like a local blueberry stand. Like blueberries were like they were like her favorite. And then when they moved out here, it was like, okay, what's a way to bring that tradition into my new home, my new live space? And so she planted a blueberry bush for her mom and made like a little memorial place out in her backyard at the blueberry bush for mom. And then maybe a year and a half later found out they're going to move. And so they decided to transplant the blueberry bush to the new home because that was quote unquote mom's blueberry bush. And I just, again, like that's so unique to that client's grief experience and their relationship with their person and their story. And so I think giving ourselves permission to be creative in what's that meaning making going to make the most sense for us. How's that going to look for our unique grief, our unique relationships, I think is so important.
Yeah. And you don't have to figure it out right away. I think sometimes there can feel like this pressure to have this act that you do, or that you've gotten the tattoo, or you've started the fundraiser or whatever. There really actually isn't pressure. It's more
No.
about you learning your grief and what that looks like for you, and then what feels supportive and helps you feel connected. And that takes time.
Yeah.
As we're thinking about our journeying forward and living with grief, we're placing sometimes like bricks in the road as we go. But sometimes it's actually just like the little pebbles. Like we're not moving forward feeling like very quick at this. We're just
No.
piecing it together. And that it can be years down the road where you've found something that feels so meaningful, but
Yeah.
it's authentic, instead of trying to force something that doesn't feel like it is supportive to you. And so knowing too, I don't have to have pressure around this. It is okay. It is.
Absolutely. And I think that leads into the next question. There can be this tension between wanting to hold on to our memories and fearing that they're going to fade. And that's the same with meaning making. What if I forget what felt meaningful, or I get busy and forget to do the thing that I wanted to do to honor my grief, or I couldn't pick the perfect thing because I put too much pressure on myself for it to be the perfect thing? How do we help encourage people to keep that connection to their person while also making space for their own grief?
Yeah. I think sometimes it can help to look for evidence earlier on in your life, right? That you have probably had people that have come and gone in your life that made an impact, right? Positive or negative. And you might not remember every single detail, right? You might not remember every single conversation or everything you did together, but you can remember, "Oh, that was really fun. I really had a great time with that person." Or, "Ooh, that was really rough. And that left an impact on me. That was really significant." And maybe you're not remembering all of the details, but your heart kind of remembers, right? You have this overall like knowing, this internal knowing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's important with our grief too, is to be able to know, okay, I already have evidence that I can stay connected to past memory. And so with my person, maybe I forget the specific details of a specific conversation, but my heart remembers our love and our connection, and my heart never forgets that.
Mm.
And so to be able to just be kind to yourself, that it is okay that some things may soften over time. Your heart does not forget the time you had with that person, the impact they had in your life. I think that is so important, because we want to cling on to every single experience. And meanwhile, we're trying to live forward, and we've got sick kids, and we've got other things happening in our lives and new seasons, and we're trying to live forward. We're clinging on, and that's so hard. And
Yeah.
getting to the place where you can begin to trust yourself. Like, my heart is never going to forget my person. It's
No.
just impossible.
And I think that's where community in grief can be so helpful too, is not being the only person remembering the memories, remembering that person. As you were talking, that came to mind, Garrett's the 15-year anniversary party that we had. And everyone was so intentional with going around and sharing specific Garrett memories. And it was like stuff I hadn't remembered, and it was so cool to hear other stories that, like, I know I was there for, and yet that hadn't registered as maybe more important, but it was meaningful and important for a different family member or friend. And it was like, "Oh, I'm not the only one remembering them. Like, I'm not the only one carrying their legacy." And so I think that's where that community piece can be really helpful in finding connection and ways to share stories and keepsakes and things like that over
I love
time.
Oh, I love that so much, and it is so important. And some people won't have that
Right.
family grief experience, and that is okay, but that's part of the grief too,
Yeah.
is I wish I had someone to
Right.
be able to remember with me, or I wish that my child had lived long enough to have all of those memories,
Yeah.
which is still where community can come into play and be so supportive, whether it's joining a support group or being with someone else who just gets it, who's had a grief experience, to be able to say, "Oh, me too." Or, "I've been feeling this way, X, Y, and Z," which gives you the opportunity to say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but that makes so
Yeah.
much sense." And then we're not alone in it as we're carrying this forward.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, absolutely. Ugh. Sometimes grief doesn't really hit until years later, and people feel like they've missed their window to grieve, quote unquote, the right way. How do you help folks who feel like they're just now processing a loss from way back.
I sometimes will have clients come in, and I bet you do too, that are like, I just wasn't ready. People suggested I went to therapy, but I didn't want to do that for whatever reason. But that was you taking care of you. That was you knowing
Yeah.
what you needed when you needed it. And then being able to say, well, I need it now. I need
Yeah.
the support now. I'm ready now. Okay. So instead of comparing yourself to anyone else, or like, oh, I should have done
Yeah.
it
The
a certain
shoulds.
way, like we watch out for the shoulds and all of that, because there just isn't a
Yeah.
specific roadmap. And I think that you should be wary too. Here's another should, but I actually really believe this one. Like, I do think you should be wary if you're seeing somebody say, oh, I have the blueprint for helping you navigate grief. No, because nobody knows your grief experience, how it shows up for you. No one had the relationship you did with your person. No one has your same exact personality and loss history. It is completely unique. And so getting to a place, again, that self-trust piece of, okay, it makes sense that I'm here now. This is coming up for me now, and I'm making some intentional space for it now. Okay. I wasn't ready before. Okay.
Yeah.
And being able to just meet yourself where you're at.
Yeah. A common thing that I've had come up with the delayed grief is a few women who were either about to have a baby or recently postpartum, and a parent died. And I was drowning in postpartum, and now my kid is 2, and I missed my parent that whole time, and yet I finally have capacity now. So there's these compounding life events that just make grief more complicated. And you're right, like we didn't have the spoons, the capacity to handle it. And so we're doing this like retroactive grief work. And it's like the grief from the really hard postpartum experience is blending in with the grief of their lost parent. And that happens. And it's so complicated, and it gets to take up space. And so it's going to look really different probably than how you were expecting it to. I don't know if that's something you've seen too.
Yeah, for sure. I've had women who have experienced maybe a pregnancy loss in the midst of another loss or a really challenging season, and weren't able to really make space or hold a lot of space for that particular loss. And then feeling I didn't grieve my pregnancy the right way, my
Yeah.
child, or I didn't do it the right way. But we only have so much capacity, right? We're doing what we can every step of the way. And so that is okay. And
Yeah.
honoring and making space for where it is now and what you need now. That's so important. And there are these really complex seasons in our lives, like we've been talking about today. Just grief doesn't show up at these predictable spaces where you have all the ability to be able to take a pause from life. You can't. You're postpartum and experiencing the death of a parent. You can't just pause that postpartum moment. Your hormones are finding a way. Your life that you're caring for needs you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it makes sense that we're just taking one small step at a time. And it isn't that you're not acknowledging that grief happened. It isn't that you dissociated and didn't know that grief happened, that loss happened. Like, your client obviously knew, and she was holding space for that in the way that she could.
Yeah.
And now she's able to hold space for it in a new way.
Yeah.
Which also is important too. I think going back even to where I started in my career working in grief was with children, and doing so much education for parents around how grief, you can experience it again at new developmental levels. So someone who experienced a grief when they were 5 or 6, they're going to experience it again as a teenager, looking at it now through new eyes. What does it mean to be growing up, thinking about becoming an adult without this person in my life? And then what about in college? Were we experiencing grief?
Yeah.
And we can understand that for kids. Okay, that makes sense. But it happens for us too as adults, because we're entering different seasons as we're moving into adulthood, maybe getting married, changes in your family structure, kids, aging parents. There's so many different seasons we go through as adults that will re-trigger or make us see our grief in a new way.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that was just something that came up for me as we were talking.
Time is a resource. And I think we forget that, and we don't always have the time to grieve in the way that we want when we want. And so we wait until we have the spoons to do that. So even in thinking about your kiddo examples, like when you're 5, you don't have the capacity, the time, or the mental resources to grieve in the way that you would as a teenager, as a young adult, as a new parent. And what those losses mean for you. I think it's important to remind ourselves that I don't have the time right now, and that's okay. That doesn't mean I'm failing. That doesn't mean I'm grieving wrong. It just means I need to wait until that becomes a resource. And if it continues to not be a resource, how do I make it? How do I make space for that to become a resource? Whether that's asking for help or saying no to some things because I need to prioritize grieving in a way that's not going to get me stuck.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. I think it's really important. Yes, it's time and it's also just whatever season of life you're in. It's just really it's complicated. It's all so messy. I always come back to talking about it being messy because it is.
Yeah.
And just knowing, okay, this is messy. This is part of life. And that makes sense that it's messy. And I'm going to meet myself where I'm at today. And even though in grief it often feels like Groundhog's Day, there's actually like subtle changes over time. And it's not going to feel this way always. It's
Yeah.
going to feel different. I will have more capacity, more space, more ability to interact with this kind of grief for a different surge of grief, for healing. It's all
Yeah.
going to shift. It's so subtle sometimes.
Yeah. So I guess what would you say as we kind of wrap up this conversation are 2 or 3 main takeaways for listeners to remember about making grief their own and grief over time?
Yeah. I think going back to, I like the conversation we had about the tsunami event.
Yeah.
When we have those events, I mean, grief in general can be its own tsunami, especially early on. And then we're going to have these surges of grief over time too. I feel like there is an opportunity to meet ourselves in our grief after those tsunami events in really intentional ways, and to learn what it is that this grief is showing us, what we need, how we care for ourselves, and also how we begin to rebuild, and knowing that takes time too, and that is okay. So I think that's one thing. I know like this through line that we have talked about is just how messy and unpredictable it is, that it's going to show up as it does when at the inconvenient times it's showing up. And that messiness means that sometimes we have differences in our capacity and our abilities to care for ourselves and our grief, and to be able to just pay attention to what is it that I'm needing right now, and meeting that where it is, and knowing you're never going to be forgetting this grief. You're never going to forget your person. It's slowly figuring out whether it's a brick in the road of this path as you're living forward, or just the little pebbles. You're slowly figuring this out, and that you don't have to do it alone.
That's so great. Is there anything that you were hoping we would cover today that we haven't touched on?
No, I always love talking with you
I
about
know.
grief. I think there's something really important in grief work to having some lived experience and all of the professional experience that you bring for your clients and to the listeners, because that intersection of personal experience and professional expertise is so important. Because you can read something in a textbook, and until you've lived it, you don't get it in this.
Yeah.
And so I'm really glad that we're able to have these conversations.
Me too. My favorite metaphor is you learn a new language when you've experienced a loss. And so it's like, how do I speak grief? And I think the more that we speak grief, we can work on normalizing talking about it in this very grief illiterate, grief phobic society that we exist in, because it is something so many of us experience. So
Yeah.
I love getting to talk to you about this stuff too. It's great.
Yeah.
So, Jen, you have some really cool projects coming down the pipe. Do you want to share with listeners? And then also, how can they connect with you to work with you?
Yeah, I would love that. So I am over on Instagram at Living Forward Together. And then you can also find me at reisingercoaching.com. So I am building a 12-week grief support coaching program for women who have experienced pregnancy, infant, or child loss. My time in working in grief and loss really came to start working with families who had experienced the death of a child. And so it's been this area of my career that's been really important to me and I'm really passionate about. And so I'm looking forward to offering this as a support for women walking that journey, because it is so isolating and it is so painful. And many therapists that are working with people after a loss feel, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to support these women. And so it's really a mission of mine to create a safe space for women walking that road. So I would love to be supportive. You can reach out anytime. And then I also have my therapy practice at reisingercounseling.com, where I specialize in perinatal mental health and grief and loss as well.
Awesome. Be sure to follow her on Instagram. Her content is so good, you guys. It's so good. She's always quippy and then also heartwarming. Like you crush the real game. I'm always so impressed by your content. Yes. All right, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in today. Remember to be kind to yourselves and take care. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If this conversation resonated with you or you think it might benefit someone else, please share it. Sharing can open doors to healing, understanding, and normalizing these griefy conversations. If you're craving deeper insights or ongoing support, consider signing up for the Grief Gap newsletter. It's packed with resources, tips, and personal stories to help you navigate your grief journey. Visit the website www.griefisthenewnormal.com to subscribe. For those who prefer a more personal touch to their healing process, check out my grief journal, Authentically Unapologetic. It's designed to help you explore your grief on your own terms with prompts and exercises that encourage reflection and growth. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and I look forward to our next meaningful conversation. Our soothing tunes are provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in sharing your story, collaborating, or learning more, please email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. You can also stream the episodes on YouTube for more engaging content. Until next time, keep exploring your grief with intention and support, remembering you don't have to do this alone.